At the end of the 19th century, Paris was undergoing a profound cultural reorientation. Traditional sources of meaning, such as religion, the monarchy, or national identity, had lost much of their authority, while modern conceptions of the self had not yet stabilized. The fin de siècle was marked less by ideological certainty than by fragmentation of belief systems, social roles, and artistic norms. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the Montmartre district became a testing ground for alternative lifestyles and artistic experiments. Bohemian artists flocked to Montmartre's cabarets and studios, redefining identity, flirting with occult spiritualities, and cultivating personas that blurred art and life. Erik Satie stands at the center of this transformation. Often dismissed as an eccentric or a marginal figure, Satie is better understood as a composer confronting a broader cultural problem: how to construct artistic and personal coherence in a world where traditional structures no longer command belief. Satie's unusual music, lifestyle, and self fashioning were not arbitrary quirks, but adaptive strategies. Across his trajectory, he developed an aesthetic response to cultural disintegration. His life and work offer an early model of the modern artist who replaces ideology with style, belief with form, and authority with irony. In the 1890s, Montmartre was a decentralized, self curated bohemia perched on a hill north of Paris. Formerly a rural village of vineyards and windmills, it had been annexed by the city but retained a quirky, semi rustic character of steep streets and old mills. Cheap rents and a location away from the bourgeois city center turned Montmartre into a working class neighborhood known for its revolutionary politics and underground culture. Into this rough milieu flooded artists, writers, and musicians, seeking freedom from convention. High and low society intermingled in Montmartre dance halls and cabarets. Students and bohemian creatives rubbed shoulders with laborers, prostitutes, and bourgeois thrill seekers, drawn to the hill's famous absinthe bars and nightlife. The area's hedonistic reputation lured those dissatisfied with Victorian morality. In a city where respectable life was tightly corseted, Montmartre offered a place to reinvent oneself far from societal judgment. Many now legendary personalities found refuge and inspiration in Montmartre's subculture. In Montmartre, intolerance was not in fashion, and queer subcultures and unconventional relationships could flourish relatively openly. This atmosphere of social freedom went hand in hand with artistic innovation. The iconic cabarets of Montmartre, like Le Chat Noir and Moulin Rouge, became hotbeds of avant garde art and music. Le Chat Noir, founded in 1881, was the archetype of Montmartre cabaret. Its gothic Japanese decor and shadow puppet theater earned it the nickname the Louvre of Montmartre, and a sign at the door exhorted visitors to be modern. In its smoke filled rooms, poets recited verse, satirists sang cutting songs, and absinthe flowed freely. Le Chat Noir Shadow Theater epitomized the neighborhood's blend of playfulness and artistry. It became Montmartre's symbol of fierce independence and nocturnal mischief. Erik Satie arrived at the scene as a young cast out of the musical establishment. Born in Normandy in 1866, he had dropped out of the Paris Conservatoire twice. He came to be known as the laziest student in the world by his professors. After a brief and deliberately sabotaged stint in the military, the penniless Satie gravitated to Montmartre in 1887, drawn by its libertine energy and cheap lodgings. There, he made a living as a pianist in cabarets and café-concerts, immersing himself in the popular music scene of the quartier. Between 1887 and 1890, Satie was the house pianist at Le Chat Noir, performing nightly in the cabaret's whimsical atmosphere. He befriended Claude Debussy at the Chat Noir's piano and even advertised his early compositions like the Ogive in the cabaret's weekly journal. Satie's job entailed improvising background music, accompanying singers, and contributing little waltzes or songs for the crowd. This work was far from the lofty concert hall. It was entertainment for absinthe-soaked revelers. Yet, it honed Satie's penchant for simplicity and satire. Satie adopted the fashion and lifestyle of the Montmartre eccentrics. Always short on money, he lived in a cramped room and ate his meals at cheap cafes. Montmartre, precarious freedom, shaped Satie's art. In 1888, amid the din of dance halls and café-concerts, he produced the first Gymnopédies. These pieces were radically simple and restrained, in an era when music was trending toward Wagnerian grandiosity. Satie's gentle, repetitive melodies and unresolved chords seemed to resist the emotional excess of Romanticism, much as Montmartre's ironists resisted the pieties of bourgeois art. Historians now credit Satie's early Montmartre compositions with anticipating 20th century minimalism, decades ahead of time. At the very least, his music offered a radically fresh approach that helped liberate French music from Wagner's shadow. Debussy later admitted that Satie showed imagination and was more daring than anyone, nudging Debussy himself toward new musical paths. In Montmartre, Satie had found a fertile chaos that emboldened him to question every rule of his art. Satie's brief relationship with the painter Suzanne Valadon offers a rare glimpse beneath his cultivated detachment. They met in January 1893 at the Auberge du Clou, and after the first night together, Satie impulsively proposed marriage in the early hours of the morning. Though Valadon declined, the two became lovers and lived in adjacent rooms for months. Satie nicknamed her his Biki and flooded her with love letters. During this turbulent period, Valadon painted an intense portrait of Erik Satie, and Satie composed piano miniatures for her, notably Bonjour Vicky Bonjour. But the romance was not to last. Valadon grew restless and abruptly left Satie after 6 months. Satie was devastated. He later confessed that he was left with nothing but an icy loneliness that fills the head with emptiness and the heart with sadness. Some biographers even link the eerie chords and obsessive repetition of Satie's Vexations to the despair and heartbreak he felt after Valadon's departure. True or not, the episode highlights the emotional volatility beneath Satie's eccentric exterior. It also underscores Montmartre's bohemian reality, intense love affairs, and unconventional living. In 1898, seeking greater solitude and lower rent, he moved out of Montmartre to the suburban Village d'Arcueil, effectively ending his first bohemian chapter. Montmartre had been Satie's proving ground as he negotiated life outside the academy. In that cauldron of absinthe, art, and anarchy, Satie forged a musical sensibility that rejected romanticism in favor of irony, simplicity, and repetition. His early works and experiences set the stage for the even more radical experiments to come. If Montmartre offered Satie a bohemian community, it did not provide a stable belief system. In the 1890s, mystical orders and esoteric cults proliferated in Paris. Satie's next move can be read less as devout conversion than as an attempt to navigate the collapse of conventional meaning systems. Many fin de siècle artists turn to mysticism not necessarily out of deep conviction, but because traditional forms of meaning had weakened, and new scientific paradigms lacked emotional resonance. In an era when science and secularism were on the rise, mystic movements promised an alternative way to rebel against materialism and find order amid chaos. Paris hosted theosophists contacting astral planes, Rosicrucians reviving medieval Catholic ritual, and even Satanism and black masses saw a revival. This climate offered fertile ground for a precursor like Satie. In 1891, Satie became involved with the Ordre de la Rose-Croix, a mystical society founded by Joséphin Péladan. It was a heady mix of neo-Catholic mysticism, Wagnerian aesthetics, and esoteric symbolism. For a time, Satie was enthralled by the quasi-medieval pageantry of Péladan's circle. He was appointed the official composer for the order and provided music for Péladan's mystical dramas. Satie composed pieces like Le Fils des Étoiles as incidental music to Péladan's esoteric plays, and Trois Sonneries de la Rose-Croix to accompany the order's rituals. These works broke with musical convention. For example, no bar lines or time signatures, creating a sense of timeless float that matched the atmosphere. It's easy to see why the young composer found this environment appealing. The Rosicrucian rites were colorful and eccentric, filled with spiritist seances, medievalist costumes, and a pervasive neurotic mysticism. For a while, Satie immersed himself in this occult refuge from modern life. Yet, his flirtation with mysticism was always tinged with irony, and it proved short-lived. He had a deep psychological tension, a desire for structure versus an equally strong skepticism of any system demanding too much obedience. By early 1892, Satie publicly broke with Péladan and founded his own church, a one-man spiritual parody called the Église métropolitaine d'art de Jésus conducteur, or the Metropolitan Church of Art of Jesus the Conductor. Operating from his tiny room at 6 Rue Cortot, Satie appointed himself parson and chapel master of this imaginary sect and proclaimed that its disciples would number in the hundreds of millions. He issued florid manifestos and papal-style edicts that condemned various evildoers in the art world. The language of these documents was an over-the-top pastiche of Péladan's mystical prose. For example, Satie's church mission statement vowed to create a refuge where the Catholic faith and the arts shall grow and prosper, sheltered from profanity, unsullied by the workings of evil. Music critics and adversaries were excommunicated with insults. The notorious critic Henri Gauthier-Villars, who had mocked Satie's music, was denounced to languish in grief, in silence, and in painful meditation for blaspheming Wagner. When Henri retorted by calling Satie an inconsequential buffoon, Satie responded that his depravity had caused his own downfall. The feud grew over time and eventually degenerated into a fistfight at a concert in 1904, when Satie punched him in the face. Gauthier-Villars hit him with his walking stick, and then the police arrested Satie and took him away. In 1895, Satie composed the Messe des Pauvres, a haunting liturgical mass that was the culmination of his mystic period. And significantly, when he left mysticism behind, Satie did not simply return to conventional life. He pivoted to an even more ironic and absurdist stance. Going forward, he would pursue a different strategy to impose meaning on his life, not through spiritual systems, but through the sculpting of his own self. Satie's next great project would be Erik Satie himself. With organized religion firmly rejected, Satie turned to personal style as the source of coherence in his life. Satie anticipated a modern idea. Identity can be a work of art. Rather than accepting a conventional social role, he curated an eccentric persona down to the tiniest detail. His habits, dress, and even his diet became a kind of performance, a continuous artwork expressing who he was. This was a deliberate response to a world where identity was no longer inherited, but had to be constructed. Satie's self-fashioning aligns with what cultural theorists call aesthetic subjectivity, in which individuals express inner coherence through style rather than through creed or social status. Satie's cultivated eccentricity manifested in famously bizarre routines. He proceeded to live in a manner that can only be described as legendary. He owned a set of 7 identical gray velvet suits, one for each day of the week, and wore nothing else for years. He carried a black umbrella everywhere, eventually amassing dozens of them. Yet he avoided ever opening them outdoors, preferring to get wet. He affected an air of bourgeois propriety with his bowler hat and wing collar. His diet, however, defied all bourgeois sensibilities. Satie famously insisted that he ate only white foods. In a wry piece of paper, he listed the items he consumed: eggs, sugar, shredded bones, the fat of dead animals, white vegetables like turnips, sausages soaked in white wine, fruit mold, rice, pastry, and cheese. He also claimed that he dined in just 4 minutes. Satie maintained absolute privacy about his living space. After moving to the small suburban room in Arcueil in 1898, he never allowed a single visitor inside for the 27 years he lived there. Friends and collaborators could meet him at cafes, but no one, not even his closest associates, saw the insides of Satie's apartment until his death in 1925. When finally entered, his room was the stuff of eccentric legend, piled floor to ceiling with hundreds of umbrellas, dozens of unopened letters, trash, and 2 pianos, one stacked on top of the other. The apartment had no bed. Satie apparently slept on a piano bench or a chair, and apparently it was filthy beyond belief. Why did Satie and others of his generation construct such personas? It was, in part, a reaction to the lack of stable identity categories at the turn of the century. The old 19th century archetypes, the patriotic citizen, the pious Christian, or the romantic genius, were in doubt. The modern urban self was more fragmented and free floating. In Montmartre and similar bohemian hubs, individuals began constructing coherence through lifestyle. The persona became a substitute for the comforting narratives that had eroded. Satie was not unique in this. The dandyism of Baudelaire or the aristocratic posturing of Oscar Wilde are other examples of identity as art in the late 1800s. Not everyone understood this at the time. Many of Satie's contemporaries simply thought him a charming eccentric, a musical original with odd habits, and critics sometimes mocked his affectations. The press nicknamed him the Velvet Gentleman, and accounts circulated of his absurd quirks. But those closer to Satie recognized a method in the madness. Composer Darius Milhaud recalled that Satie's eccentric persona was like a suit of armor. It protected his uniquely sensitive mind and deflected a world he found ridiculous and vulgar. By inventing a personal myth, he could participate in society on his own terms. In the 1910s, Satie entered the final phase of his career. His collaborations with younger artists like Jean Cocteau, Pablo Picasso, and Sergei Diaghilev exemplified the new strategies of modernist culture. Satie, once a misfit on the margins, suddenly became a central figure in Paris' avant-garde explosion, precisely because his sensibility was perfectly attuned to the emerging modern atmosphere. The watershed moment came with Parade, a one-act ballet produced by Sergei Diaghilev. Satie composed the music, Cocteau wrote the scenario, and Picasso designed the costumes and sets, a true interdisciplinary mix of art forms. Parade was nothing short of revolutionary. Into Satie's orchestra pit were thrown sounds never before considered musical: typewriters clacking, a ticking telegraph, sirens, foghorns, and pistol shots. The ballet portrayed a ragtag troupe of circus performers trying to attract an audience, blending everyday street noise with jazz riffs and music hall tunes. Picasso's costumes were giant cardboard constructions which made the performance movements stiff and puppet like. The overall effect was both whimsical and unsettling, a parody of showbiz that itself was high art. Parade's premiere incited a scandal, with baffled critics and audience members split over whether it was all a joke. To the outrage of some, Cocteau had promoted the ballet with a manifesto praising the humanity of the music and praising the score. The French press did not like that. One conservative critic called the work insane and insulting. Satie, never one to let an insult slide, responded by mailing that critic a postcard that said, "Sir, you are merely an arse." This landed Satie in legal trouble for defamation. He narrowly avoided jail after friends intervened. Such was the price of being too far ahead of your time. But history vindicated Parade. It is now seen as a masterpiece that anticipated much of 20th century's art direction. It broke down the barrier between noise and music, between high arts and low entertainments, poking fun at art's pretensions even as it expanded its possibilities. Satie pioneered techniques that would dominate 20th century art and music. He also coined the term furniture music for compositions intended as background sound to be heard but not listened to, effectively foretelling modern ambient music. He even invented a kind of proto-prepared piano by inserting paper between piano strings to alter the sound, predating John Cage's experiments by decades. All these subversive touches were Satie's way of questioning the very conditions of art. What is music? What is performance? What is the role of the composer versus the listener? His compositions did not restore tension, they exposed it. They do not express emotion, they question the conditions under which emotion can be expressed. In pieces like Vexations, composed in 1893, he took musical repetition to an absurd extreme. The score consists of a short, eerie theme with the instruction to play this motif 840 times in succession. Clearly, Satie never expected this to be literally performed, and it wasn't until John Cage produced its first public performance in 1963 in New York City. He set the admission price at $5 and had a time clock installed in the lobby of the theater. Each patron checked in with the clock, and when leaving the concert, checked out again and received a refund of 5 cents for each 20 minutes endured. But he had underestimated the length of time the concert would take, which lasted way over 18 hours. The point was conceptual, to mock the romantic notion of development and climax in music by positing an endless, directionless repetition. Through all these avant-garde endeavors, Satie maintained a stance of ambiguity. Was he serious or was he joking? The answer was usually both. He loved to keep his audience guessing, knowing that this uncertainty was itself a reflection of modern life. His final public persona, the velvet gentleman who wrote outrageous music, was the ultimate irony. Once the misfit of Montmartre, he had become an unlikely prophet of modernism. Erik Satie's relevance today goes far beyond his historical contributions to music. Satie matters because he directly confronted a problem that recurs in every era of rapid change. How does one construct a coherent inner life when the surrounding world offers no stable guidance? This question is just as pressing in the 21st century. The same forces that unsettle us now were already in play in Satie's day. Satie responded to an anxious, groundless moment in Western culture with unique humor and creativity. Rather than despair, he turned ambivalence into art. Rather than fleeing fragmentation, he made it his home. He offers an example of how to live creatively with uncertainty. He demonstrated that ambiguity itself can be fertile. that one can be serious and non-serious at the same time, and that beauty can be found in restraints and understatement. The mind of a man who refused to be pinned down by the demands of his time,